Good evening, everyone, and welcome to our first Wonk Wednesday discussion of the spring semester. My name is Pete Damiano. I direct the University of Iowa Public Policy Center, and I'd like to welcome everyone to this event. Tonight, I'm very excited to introduce Tracy Osborn, who's the director of our Politics and Policy area of the Public Policy Center, and she's going to be talking about how do we recruit more women into politics. And this is not a partisan political discussion. For those of you who are familiar with the Public Policy Center, our primary objective is to do academic research to help inform policymakers. And the second part of our mission is what we call our community engagement mission, and that's sharing that information and expertise with members of the public. And that's what we're here today with people that are here and people who are watching on public access television. I'd like to thank the Iowa City Public Library for co-hosting this event. And just want to let you know that we have two future Wonk Wednesday events coming up this semester. On March 21st, we're doing one called Food for Thought, School Meals and Student Health with Natasha Askelson, who is a faculty member at the Public Policy Center, also in the College of Public Health. And on April 18th, one called America Out of Paris, the State of Global Climate Change Policy. And that is going to be done by Sylvia Secchi, who is also a faculty member at the Public Policy Center and jointly with the Geosciences GSS department here. So with that, I'm going to welcome Tracy and give us a talk about women in politics tonight.
Hi, thank you very much for coming. So as you can read, what I'm going to be talking about is how we recruit more women into politics. And first, I'd like to say sometimes the news cooperates with the particular talk you're giving. And yesterday, NPR had a story saying that there's, as you can read, more than twice as many women running for Congress in 2018, kind of post-2016 election. This phenomenon that they're reporting on is something that we do know to be true outside of Congress as well. The research project I'm starting that I'm going to talk about here tonight, some informal discussions we've had with groups. They've been contacted more than they ever remember. And so I do think, right, we're seeing this kind of moment now of more women deciding to run for office here in the United States. But this is really kind of the big picture, right? What it does to see a woman candidate, what it does to see discussions of gender in an election. What I'm actually talking about is kind of the micro part of the problem. So thinking about how we get more women to run for office, and especially from my perspective, what kind of public policy structure would enhance that, right, would make it better. So you may know this, right, if you came to this talk already, but the U.S. lags really significantly behind most of the world in women's representation. And as you can see, I focus on legislatures, but it's everything. The results are pretty consistent. So for my students in my Women in Politics class, I usually make them guess, but I won't do that to you tonight. But these are the top 20 countries in representation in the world. Most people are really surprised to find that places like Rwanda, Bolivia, Cuba, Nicaragua, Sweden, Mexico are the top places that elect women. Now, there are reasons for this, right? And it has to do primarily with the policies that they have regarding elections. Now, there are some other reasons and some other technicalities here I'd be happy to talk about. So where's the U.S.? We are 99, as you can see. I've screenshotted, again, about 20, so you can see who's around us. And you'll see that we are behind places like Pakistan, that we often think of in the U.S. as not maybe particularly democratic. Our neighbors here are Saudi Arabia, Indonesia, Kyrgyzstan, Madagascar, Tajikistan. Again, right, we kind of think of ourselves as this place full of equality and where we might expect to be kind of in the top. We're way behind, and we're even behind places that have very similar electoral structures to us by quite a bit. And so like the UK, right, we often compare to the UK. Their electoral structure in a lot of ways is much like ours. So a couple of other things to think about, right? We also have 99 other legislative bodies in the U.S., right, 99 chambers at least, 50 legislative bodies. You can see that total, the percentage of women in the state legislatures is around 25%. It's 20 in Congress, so it's a little bit better. in the state legislatures, but it varies widely. So this data is from the Center for American Women in Politics. And so if you want to look at it more, they run a great website with lots of data. You can see the top 10 states, right, top out at about 40% women, so that's actually quite close to parity. It's never gotten over 40%, I should mention. Well, actually, that's a lie. One time it did for 2 years, and then it went away. Ask me later. But you can see North Dakota, Kentucky, Tennessee down here at the bottom, they've improved a little bit, right? You can see that the lowest state, Wyoming, is barely 10% women. Ironically, right, Wyoming is the equality state that gave women the right to vote first. And so those kind of averages belie all of this variation. You can also see one other interesting fact, which is there are more Democratic women than Republican women. And so for me, that's a very interesting question of why are we seeing this party disparity as well? And the party disparity is actually widening over time. All right, so another thing we know is that when women candidates run for office, they win at the same rate that men do. Now, there's a slight caveat to that. The primary process, we have some evidence that that's not true. But this is pretty consistent. When you run a woman for office, she does just as well as a man does. So we know, therefore, the problem is getting women to enter the race in the first place. It is actually not voters that won't vote for them or things like that. Now, I'm not saying sexism doesn't exist in elections. It's a whole another different topic for later. But we do know the problem is a lack of women candidates, not widespread sexism that's keeping women from winning. So why don't women run, right? We actually have a lot of research on this particular topic. One reason we know that women choose not to run for office is something that's been labeled the ambition gap. The idea that women just think about running for office less. And when you break this down, it comes down to the idea that women feel they're less qualified to run for office. This is the case even when you ask women and men that have the same qualifications. So if you're objectively measuring their qualifications, they're the same, but their view of how qualified they are is different, in that women believe they are less qualified to run for office. We see all kinds of little things that turn off from this. For instance, women are a bit more worried about the process of elections. They don't like the process of elections. They don't like what it does to their family. They don't like the process of raising money. And so there's all kinds of ways that this plays out. So this is from a book by Jen Lawless and Richard Fox, who have actually been here as a different Public Policy Center event. That they're the ones who kind of coined this phrase, ambition gap. And I want to show you, this is their survey of women and men who all had backgrounds that objectively were great for office. Maybe they were teachers and had held, a high-level position within the education structure in their community. Maybe they were lawyers, right? The typical places we see people run from: education, business, law, et cetera. So they asked that group, how qualified are you to run for public office? You can see the difference there, and that star means it is a statistically significant difference. Women, right, are more likely to say they're not at all qualified, less likely to say they are qualified. All right, so here's another reason though, right? It's not all something that you can blame on women themselves. What we also know is that the structure of nominating in the United States, what happened? Oh. That's what happens when they give me technology. Okay, so what we do know is that there's sort of a different piece to the structure. The nominating structure in the United States is what we call localized and informal. What that means is we don't actually know how they pick the candidates in a lot of places. We know the primary process exists in most places and technically chooses the candidates, right? But there's a pre-primary stage where candidates run in the actual primary. And entering that primary election, there are all kinds of rules about who parties aren't allowed to endorse, or they're not allowed to do these particular things in different places. But that's official rules, right? And we know that this process goes on where some people are told this isn't the district for you. Some people are told, wait your turn, this isn't the time for you to run. And we also know there's an informal process when a seat is empty where party leaders at a county level or a city level go around and they say, okay, we need somebody to run. Who are 5 people I can think of out of my social circle? What we know is the people who look for recruit candidates are disproportionately male. So their social circles are disproportionately male, right? And so they may not even be conscious of doing it, but they are disproportionately recruiting men to office. We also know there's a process called gatekeeping. Gatekeeping happens when someone says, no, you can't run for this seat, right? You run for this one instead. So that kind of process top-down, combined with women who think they're not qualified to run anyway, is this force that sort of pushes women out of office from 2 different directions. All right, so how do you get more women to run, right? This becomes the problem. We know our structure is flawed. How do you overcome that? Lots of other countries, and I should say this project actually started as part of a 20-country project where we're doing the United States portion, my co-author and I, and we had to go to a conference in London and present these results, or kind of the initial part of it, and everybody would stand up and be like, we're from Portugal, and we only have, 35% women, and it's not very good, and they'd be all depressed, and then we'd stand up and be like, all right, everybody feel good about yourselves. Here's the bottom. And the interesting thing is, right, everyone else was evaluating how their formal public policy was working. So they had quotas, right? Their parties were required to run certain numbers of women. Or the parties had a kind of formal, informal agreement where they decided they were going to run this many women. Or there are even legislatures like Afghanistan where a particular set of seats are set aside for women. Remember, we wrote their constitution, right? So the U.S. actually requires Afghanistan to have more women in its Congress than we have in ours. Iraq is the same way. So anyway, we don't have these policies, right? And so instead, what we have is this sort of informal policy that's arisen over time of what we call women candidate groups. These are groups that aim to recruit women into the political process. Now, they do it a whole bunch of different ways. The problem is we don't know anything about these groups. We actually don't even know how many there are. We don't know where they exist. We don't know what kind of activities they engage in. And most importantly, we don't know how successful they are. We don't have any way of assessing whether what they're setting out to do is really what they're doing. So the big project that I'm working on is about finding these groups, cataloging them, that's the part I'm going to show you tonight, and a survey. I should say Jenna is my research assistant, so she'll be calculating these things when they come in, but a survey that is going to assess success from the group's point of view and also using some questions that we devised. So what I'm going to show you tonight is a little bit of the first part of our project. So the first part of our project is a census, right? So we're trying to count every single women candidate group in the United States. The reason we're counting them is we need their address so we can get their survey to them. But in the process, we went ahead and collected any kind of information we could get from their websites, from phone calls to them, etc. So what we have now is actually a pretty nice treasure trove of information of where these groups exist across the states and the basics of what kind of activities they engage in. So that's what I'm going to show you. Like I said, the bigger goal is a survey of these groups. I should also mention my co-author is Rebecca Kreitzer. She's at UNC Chapel Hill in the Public Policy Department, but she did get her PhD here at Iowa, so that's her connection. All right. The first thing I'll tell you is who has access to women candidate groups. I realize this may not be super easy. I had to kind of superimpose one upon the other. But what you can clearly see from this map is every state has at least one women candidate group. The coverage was actually much more than we thought it was going to be. We figured that they would be centered in a few states that had a lot of women who ran for office. That's kind of sort of true, right? You see California, Arizona, where we know that they have kind of a history of these kinds of things. But there are also places like Missouri, right? Why do they have so many? And then we look around and we think, okay, why does West Virginia and why does Vermont, which actually is perennially at the top of the number of women in their legislature, why don't they have any? right? So this doesn't actually make a ton of sense when you break it down. But even more interesting is when you break it down by partisanship and our first real discovery, which is many groups say they're not partisan, but they are in effect partisan because the abortion litmus test is so common among women candidate groups. So let me explain what I mean by that. So we found about 400 active women candidate groups in the United States. One interesting thing is we actually found 600, but a third of them we could find zero information on or get a hold of them. So that also tells us there's kind of this part that's defunct, which is a whole nother question. But of those 400, it's actually 398, we found that a big group of them were not for either party. So there's 79 Republican organizations and 80 Democratic ones out of 400, right? So they're actually less partisan than we thought. But when you break it down by the abortion litmus test, 3/4 of them, 300 of them, have an abortion litmus test. The candidate has to be either pro-life or pro-choice, or they cannot participate in that particular organization. So, though they say they're not partisan, the fact that abortion so divides our parties means that these groups are way more functionally partisan than they claim to be. And so that actually has some real implications, particularly for Republican candidates. So these are the Democratic and pro-abortion rights women candidate groups. And as you can see, they're pretty well represented in the states, right? There's very few states that don't have a Democratic or pro-abortion rights women candidate group. But when you turn to the Republican side, you can see how lightly these are spread across the country. So there are states where if you are a Republican pro-life side woman, you would not have access to a woman candidate group. And one thing I should mention is that these groups aren't open to everyone. I'll get to that in just a minute. So there's already kind of limits on some of these groups as to who can enter. So that means Republican women are not always going to have access to these kinds of groups. You also might think, you know, what are the most Republican states? And you'll notice that's not where the groups are, right? So where you might have a supply of Republican women wanting to run, right? Think of maybe North Carolina or Georgia or Alabama or Iowa, right? There actually is no formal Republican women candidate group there, right, remember we're kind of superimposing the anti-abortion rights women's candidate groups with them. So point one is it's way more partisan than it looks on the surface. Point two is that these groups are much older than we thought they would be to some degree, but there's a pattern to how they're developing over time. So this information, like I said, we mostly got from their kind of bios on their websites. We called when we couldn't get it. So of the groups that we have this information for, which is most of them, you'll see that we've charted when they started. Interestingly, there's kind of three main points in time, well, maybe four. Here we see the post-suffrage groups that develop. Most of these are going to be your Republican women's federations, your Democratic women's federations. One interesting thing is that women were disproportionately Republican when suffrage happened. And so the Republican groups tended to form right after suffrage as a consequence of that. The Democratic groups sometimes formed maybe 20 years later, right, kind of just a little bit after, because there weren't as many women in them. But we actually know from some work from a history PhD that finished at Iowa about 10 years ago that these groups were very ancillary, right? They weren't really tied into what the parties were doing. They were doing a lot of the housekeeping work of the political parties. And so one thing we don't know is how really well tied in they are to the party structure. They also didn't recruit candidates at first, right? This is something they've started to adopt in a more modern context. We also see a pretty big spike in groups in the second wave of feminism. A lot of these are now chapters in the states, the National Organization for Women. Now, when they started, of course, they also did not recruit candidates expressly for office, but they now run programs that do that. So a lot of these groups, right, the creation of the WCG is a little bit different. In the 1990s, you'll notice a little bit of a spike. Oh, crud, I keep hitting the thing. And that's mostly the list groups. If you're familiar with politics, you probably know Emily's List. This was the first so-called list group. It donates to pro-choice women, right? There again, we have a nonpartisan but abortion litmus tested group. And lots of groups, both Republican and Democratic, started with this kind of model, the list model. So there's Lillian's List and in North Carolina, so we've actually talked to quite a few of these. They, from the outset, donated to women's candidate groups, but they've expanded into some other activities. Finally, if you look kind of past 2000, you'll notice there's been a pretty big spike in the number of groups. Now we go up to about 2016, so we're not going to see any spike that might have happened since the 2016 election, right? These data literally cut off right at the election last year. And these are groups, right? They're not the people they recruit. But I want to tell you especially about the groups since 2000. You see our coding down here, right? Republican anti-abortion groups. You see how almost flat this line is, right? And that's like 1. So there's your 1 group. But what you see is they're largely Democratic or nonpartisan. The nonpartisan ones tend to be actually focused on college students now. So I don't know if any of you who look like you're in college have been doing Ready to Run here or anything like that. So we actually have a chapter of this on our campus. Iowa State has one. These groups teach women leadership skills in college. They don't necessarily want those women to run for office, right? They talk about it a lot, but the extended goal is to make them think about the process of running for office. So they're training something that's a little bit different. But this is really popular. Ready to Run is the most famous, and they actually have a fundraising campaign going on right now to put their groups in all 50 states at different colleges. So the other thing that we've seen is the Democrats have been out in front in this, which actually is sort of usually the reverse for kind of parties coming up with new ideas. But they've started something called Emerge that now exists in, I think, 23 states. And that group really focuses on getting women, Democratic women, to run for office. But there's no Republican counterpart that's emerged. And so we think that's a really interesting finding that really matches with the maps I showed you. Okay, finally, I want to talk a little bit about what these groups do. This is the heart of what we're interested in. We knew from the outset the kind of things they might do. But I can tell you now kind of basically what they do and how much they engage in. About 2/3 of our groups recruit candidates. That is, they go out and find people to run for office. That's what we mean by recruiting. Again, just under, right, 268 out of 398, they train women in candidate skills. This is pretty intense, hands-on training. So for instance, these groups will call in media specialists. They'll have, part of their program that is telling you how to make yourself look good, right, when you're on TV. They'll have, some of it is debating, right? How do you plan for debates? Some of it is, how do you organize a campaign? They even have special schools for things like campaign managers or fundraisers. One of the big things they do is try to link people up with people who could donate or teach them how to find the people who will donate. So it's really hands-on things, and most people focus on this as the thing that's going to make women's candidacies better, but we actually don't know if it's working or not. Finally, you can see about half of the groups fundraise. They actually give money to candidates or connect them with donors. We were a bit surprised to see that it's only half of the groups. The reason why we're a bit surprised is that there's a lot of focus on whether women are raising the same amounts of money, whether it's harder for women candidates to raise money. We thought more groups would be out ahead of this, of the fundraising challenge, and so I'll come back to that in just a minute. And there are actually 76 groups that do all the activities, but it's pretty interesting that most of them tend to focus on one or two. All right, so what do we conclude, right? These are really kind of overview results. As I said, we're about to survey these groups, so maybe I'll come back and tell you what we find. But I want to tell you from our purpose, from kind of our perspective, what we've concluded so far. By far the biggest thing for us is that these groups recruit women, but they often seek out a specific type of woman. Now, we're academics, right? We are, not you necessarily, but we're really interested in all the parties, all the candidates, kind of understanding what happens. So we're not criticizing these groups for doing this, right? We're not trying to say that what they're doing is wrong. But what we're saying is this is a very different strategy from having an electoral quota, right, where everyone is required to run women. This is a selective strategy, right? It only runs certain types of women. One thing we're putting in the survey that we're really interested in is women of color, women from different economic backgrounds, right? How diverse is this group of women that they're recruiting? Most of the time you have to pay to go to these organizations, and they're pretty expensive, the tuition. And so we imagine that a woman who is highly educated and has the money and time to attend these things is the one that is going to go. So I think there's actually even more to seeking out a specific type of woman than we think there is. I should mention kind of the smaller point here, which is the type of woman right now is primarily focused on the abortion litmus test. To us, what this says is, again, we're not criticizing groups for doing that, but it means access is not open to particularly women who are not pro-choice. It also means, or disproportionately less open, it also means that that's the issue of focus, right? And so we might ask the normative question, should that be the issue of focus in electing women, right? Is that the only reason we care about electing women? So not all groups focus on it, but remember I told you 3/4 of them do care about the abortion position of their candidate. That's a lot. All right, second thing, Democratic women fare better than Republican women. I study the differences between partisan women in the rest of my work, so this one is the one that particularly interests me. Again, right, these groups, in part, they want it to be disproportionate, right? They want particular partisan women in office. But we're seeing increasingly that Democratic women are succeeding and Republican women are struggling. The number of Republican women is going down, and the ones who are getting recruited are ideologically more conservative than the ones who used to be in office. So there are real implications for legislatures in disproportionate recruiting. I can't emphasize that enough. Another paper that we have actually shows that Republican women are becoming increasingly conservative in a number of states, and it's because they're being replaced by new Republican women legislators, right? It's not that they're changing their minds. All right, so third, we wonder if campaign finance should be a bigger focus. We're a bit surprised at groups that do not focus on campaign finance. Now, there's probably a reason for that, right? It's really hard. But within the context of current laws, this might really be holding women back who want to run for office, that they're not getting the advice as to how to raise money, right? As we know, it's pretty essential. Finally, this one I didn't talk a whole lot about, but I think it goes back to kind of where I started from. We have this informal, localized recruitment structure that we don't know how it works, right? It's sort of this black box. We don't really know how people get chosen a lot of times, right? Sometimes they just need a candidate and they pick whoever's standing over in the corner. Sometimes they need someone to fill a position, right? Somebody asks their best friend. What we don't know is this big recruiting network, these women candidate groups, how tied in are they with that black box, right? So these groups could be doing all of the most wonderful work in the world, telling women they should run for office and training them how to do it. But if they're not connected in with the party structure, those women are not going to be able to get in, right? And that's really a puzzle that we can't get at with these data, but might be the real difference between our kind of group network policy here in the US and a more formal structured policy like we see in much of Europe, much of South America, much of Africa. So that's all I have, so I'm happy to answer questions if anybody has any, but thank you.
If anybody does have questions, I'm going to ask you to ask it through the microphone so we can capture it for the recording. So you can just raise your hand and I'll bring this over.
So I'm an elected official here,
Hi.
Mike Carberry, and I self-identify as a male. But I find this very interesting, and I mean, some of these things I did not know. Some of these things I did. We've had a group in the state called 50-50 by 2020 for a long time, and I've always thought that, you know, as actually a member of the State Central Committee of the Iowa Democratic Party, I believe that we should elect as many women as possible, but I always believe we need to elect the right women. And, you know, I wouldn't say, you know, we used to be in that really bad statistics that we had never elected a woman governor or to Congress, and now we've haven't elected the governor yet, but she was kind of elected her as lieutenant governor.
Yeah.
But we did elect Joni Ernst, and I still have bread bags that I need to loan her so she can keep her feet dry. But so I always believe that it's more about policy than it is about gender, and that, you know, I also self-identify as a feminist. So I think this is really, really important, and I just applaud you for your work. But you know, I've actually had disagreements with the people in 50-50 2020, and asked them, you know, isn't the policy just as important as the gender? And to them, it doesn't seem to be. But to me, that it is, that we need to elect the right women or men to every office. And that's why the resistance is so strong right now, because we've elected some of the wrong people at the state level and at every level. But, you know, the people that we elect to nonpartisan races are also our bench for those partisan races. And so the city council races and the school board races are technically nonpartisan, but a lot of times they do fall along partisan lines.
Yeah, like Nebraska, where everybody
Yes,
knows who they are.
But
nonpartisan.
but that's where we get our bench, and so we need more women to run for city council. We need more women to run for school boards, because then they get known. We also need them to run in, if they didn't attend their caucus, they should, because that's how they get in that apparatus that you were talking about, that the party apparatus, and to become, and you don't even, you know, we have a lot of holes in the Johnson County Democrats. If you happen to be a Democrat, you can attend our monthly meetings and just start volunteering. And then you get known. And then the kind of the players get to know you, and then they get to like you. And especially if you're a worker and you volunteer and you help the party do things, then your name gets known. And that's how you get up. And so you don't become a nobody anymore. So get
Right.
involved in your, yeah. And so can you address that a little bit?
Sure. I actually have a couple of things that came to mind. I have to say, well, Jean Lloyd Jones, actually, who's one of the founders of 50-50 in 2020, read our survey and helped us with it as a member of a women candidate group and a former legislator. And so I'm very familiar with 50-50 in 2020. I'll say they're actually quite unusual in that they are bipartisan and nonpartisan, and they're very explicitly so. And they train college students, but also women who aren't college students. And so I think they actually are sort of an interesting model that I'm surprised more states haven't adopted. From my perspective as an academic, I actually think there are reasons to elect Republican and Democratic women. So for me, it's not just about the policy, because we know things sort of, right, that we keep calling it the Hillary Clinton effect. That effect exists for Angela Merkel too, right? So for who's a conservative leader of Germany. So for any woman who's in office, you know, young women see that and they become kind of inspired and interested. And there's actual research on this, that when more women are in office, you get more young women running as well. So I do think it changes the structure over time. And one thing I would say, you know, you mentioned kind of the caucus structure and how you become a candidate. That's, to me, is actually part of the problem, right? Is that there's this informal recruitment structure that exists that women are not necessarily traditionally a part of, right? Maybe their jobs aren't traditionally a part of it. Maybe the ways they interacted, right? Remember, I mentioned the ancillary women's groups in some of these parties. I'm not saying the Iowa Democrats are that way or anything like that, but rather that we know some of those things actually are why women don't get asked to run for office. And so some of it, I'd actually like to see that structure change and become something more formalized. where anybody who's not necessarily right in kind of the in crowd could be in there. The last thing I would mention, right, is I fully agree. Women of different parties create different policies, right? That's actually what the biggest part of my research is on. And so I'm happy to discuss that later. But we also know there are some really cool things about how women legislate, and they actually do it differently. They're more cooperative. They're less zero-sum in decision-making. So if you give them money to divide up, they're going to make sure people get a little bit of the package rather than. Now, that doesn't mean all women are like that. It just means disproportionately women are like that, right? And we have some studies that demonstrate that in and outside of legislatures. So I do think there are ways that women are fundamentally different legislators aside from parties. But the giant caveat is these groups, I'm not criticizing them for recruiting specific women, right? What I'm saying is the fact that we don't have a formal policy in the United States means that this is how we recruit women. And so it is very policy specific, right? Maybe Americans like that, right? That's nothing wrong with that. But I do think it recruits a different group of women than a more formalized policy would. Does that make sense? So, sorry, I'm happy to discuss afterwards too if you want.
Hi there. I have a question for you,
Sure.
actually, about sort of the proportion of nonpartisan groups to ones that you may say that they're nonpartisan, but in
Right.
fact have that litmus test.
Correct.
Because, well, I'm just going to leave it there.
Yeah.
I might have a follow-up.
No, it's okay. So you're.
No, you
Oh.
answer, and then I'll.
Oh, sure. Let me follow
I'm
up
just
with you.
curious about what the ratio is of actual nonpartisan, like you just said,
Correct,
50-50
so-
and 20-20 is an unusual example because they really are adamantly,
Correct.
vocally bipartisan, nonpartisan. And yet you said that in much of your research, even if people talked about this as being nonpartisan, they had the anti-abortion
Right.
litmus test, therefore kind of revealing a partisan bias in general. So I was just wondering if you could speak to kind of the proportion of that, of the roughly 400 groups.
Oh, sure.
How many are those more outlier ones where they really are genuinely bipartisan or nonpartisan?
They're less common than we thought they would be. So out of about 400 active groups, about 150 are explicitly partisan groups. So, for instance, Emerge that I mentioned that has chapters in different states, that is an explicitly Democratic group, right? And I should say we're looking at state groups, so we're not including some of the national groups, but the national groups really kind of follow this model to some degree. But the abortion litmus test exists for 3/4 of the groups. So it is way more common than a group saying they're partisan. And that's kind of what our big point is that's the one issue that seems to divide. Because, if we were talking about 1990, I would say abortion did not divide the parties like that. And so I think when some of these groups started, it wasn't the divider that it is for parties now. But it's become functionally partisan because of that. For our purposes, we were a little surprised at the lack of issue diversity, right? Kind of thinking about policy. We thought we'd find groups that were centered around other policies, not just abortion. That's really uncommon. And so any group that mentions policy, it's like abortion, and then we think other things, right? But a lot of times, so for instance, they might be a Republican group, they list 4 things, right? So they list, smaller government, they list, but it's always we list pro-life, right? So it's just surprisingly common. We were really shocked. We get that abortion is a thing, right? That leads people to vote in a lot of ways sometimes, but I don't know. We're a bit surprised it's the only issue that many of these groups talk about.
I guess my follow-up then is in more of a to think about type of thing. It seems like the groups that are nonpartisan, and I actually attended one, a couple of points. One is that, in fact, they offer really reasonable for the amount that they're offering in terms of training for a boot camp, essentially. Yeah. It's really reasonable, but then they're very specific and explicit about saying, we will provide scholarships. They're very actively recruiting women of color. and women from different socioeconomic classes.
Yeah, this is actually a question on our survey, is
okay.
do they offer scholarships?
Right,
And,
so that's
yeah.
one thing in terms of bringing people in. But then what I noticed, particularly up against what you were talking about in your discussion, is that these groups really sort of do the nuts and bolts of form.
Right.
How do you, even if it is informal, what are the ways in which, to your point, Mike, that about how do you get involved? How do you get your name out there?
Yeah,
How do you
absolutely.
become a part of the mechanism to get noticed,
Right.
or simply to say, hey, I'm going to raise my hand? So it's kind of interesting because it's those groups are more really like a boot camp of how to,
Yes.
as opposed to, okay, we're going to start with a policy and then groom you from there.
Correct.
So I wondered if
and let me
you
actually
really were
be
working
clear.
at those things.
Yeah, I'm not saying they're teaching the policy, right? I'm saying they're teaching exactly what you said, right? It's just to a specific group of women decided by a policy, right? And so this is actually what surprised us, is we thought there'd be more groups like 50/50 and 2020 that were giving that kind of information out and just brought in, hey, here's the Republican, here's the Democrat, go to your corner, right? So they'll teach you how you're going to do your party's thing. And instead, right, they're kind of culling who they're training. And so they're probably doing the same things on both sides, just, you know, to a specific group of women. Yeah. Yeah.
So you said that the conservative women that are being elected tend to just be increasingly more and more conservative. Is this just a symptom of the larger issue of the parties becoming more partisan, or is this unique to women?
That's a great question. I didn't actually show this research, so but the short answer is both. It is a symptom of the parties becoming more moving outward, right? If you kind of picture them on a line, right there, the Democrats, if from an academic perspective of like measures that are kind of non-based on party, they're based around how they vote in the legislature. The Democrats haven't moved as far left as the Republicans have moved as far right. But we've watched women in the Republican Party, especially, migrate from being kind of center to on the outside of the right. So, and it's different women. So this hasn't happened in every state, but it's happening increasingly in the states, and it's happened in Congress about 2008, 2010, right, is when it starts to happen. So, my answer is both, right? The parties themselves are polarizing, but women are more polarized than they used to be, largely because of Republican women movement, but because the Democratic women haven't moved. They've always been the most lefty, right, of the Democrats. And so there's kind of this weird split between them now.
So back to getting noticed, and I was recommending, you know, you were talking about, what did you call it, the gap? You had
Ambition gap?
Ambition gap. I'll call it the arrogance gap, okay? Men have a very high opinion of themselves and maybe overinflated of their skill set. Now, I was a lobbyist for 10 years and up at the State House and locally on environmental issues, and that's one of the reasons I ran, is because inherently, most men elected officials are not the bright, you know, and sharpest crayons in the box. And you're wondering, how in the hell did they get elected? They're dumber than a stump, you know. But raising your hand at, you know, on a local level gets you noticed, and when you do that, and then if there's recruitment groups, then that's a way to get recruited, is to get noticed. But I'm seeing a lot of people, a lot of women in this cycle actually raising their own hand, not being recruited, like Jody Clemens, running from Johnson County, part of the Johnson County District, Cedar County, and Wilton against Bobby Kaufman. Her main issue is campaign finance reform, but nobody recruited her. She raised her own hand, and I love seeing that. Can
Well,
you talk about
yeah.
self-starters?
I absolutely can. You know, you hit on the nail on the head. Men are more likely to roll out of bed one day and be like, I think I'll run for office today, right? And women just aren't. And we certainly have self-starters in the United States. But, you know, from kind of looking at how parties have changed over time, and I focus on the states, but kind of generalizing across states to some degree, increasingly the party is playing a role, which is weird, right? Because partisanship in a voting way is less important to people than it used to be. I know it sounds crazy, but it really is true, right? So, you know, I'm saying they're more important in sort of the financial connections, right? And kind of providing, okay, you're in this tight race, right? We're going to get you some money from the National Party, right? Or something like that. So, the self-starters, they are less likely to be women. The point you bring up, I think, is really interesting because this kind of post-2016 thing, we have seen of any group I've talked to, 50/50 in 2020, right, some of the other ready-to-run chapters, things like that, they've seen like record people trying to enroll in their campaign schools. And so some of these people, I do think it's going through the groups. But some of it, might be going outside the groups. For my purposes, what that says is this group thing is not the only answer, right? Or, maybe this group thing doesn't work as well as we think it does. And in the survey, we're asking groups to define success first, because I think for a lot of the groups, like what Jean told us, for instance, of 50/50 in 2020, for them, success is, when they survey the people who took their course, and the people who took the course found it really useful. From our perspective, success is they got more women to run for office, right? And most groups track this, but say you train college women. How far do you track it, right? Do you track it 20 years from now? Or, so it's a hard thing to measure how successful this policy is. To give you an idea of what I'm comparing it to, I mentioned the UK, right, because they have what we call single member districts, right? One person wins from that particular district. Their electoral system is a little different, but on that point, they're really similar to us. Their parties refuse to adopt, right? They don't have a quota. They don't have like a required number of women that they have to run, any way they have to run them. But the kind of Lib Dems, but the Liberals, the Labor Party, right? So kind of the center, center, I don't know what's wrong with me. Center left, that's left for you people. They actually came up with this thing where they just stuck women in a district and said, we're going to elect a certain number of women, you go there, right? And the districts got really mad because they didn't get to pick who ran. But from the party's point of view, they're like, this is the only thing we can do. It was a really controversial policy. It's called all women shortlists. And so it's kind of gone on and off, but it jacked the number of women in Parliament up to like 38%. They used to be down with us in the 99s. So that kind of policy, we know what happens, right? And so that's our question here is sort of, this is a looser policy. How do we figure out if it's working or not? Sorry, that was a really roundabout answer to your question.
Iowa has a policy that boards and commissions should have 50% representation of women. Is there any data that says that this is successful and getting women to move from a board or commission into an elected office?
That's a great question. I have not seen anything published on it. I do know there was a project some researchers at UNI were working on about this. They were trying to figure out, they were recording, I should say they're actually at both UNIs, they're at Northern Iowa and Northern Illinois. And they were recording meetings kind of pre and post and seeing if the meetings changed when the women changed. So I assume as part of this. Also, you might want to check the Carrie Chapman Catt Center at Iowa State. They do a pretty good job, particularly on Iowa politics, and I know they were interested in tracking the boards. What I've seen is that they're having a lot of trouble getting women to sit on the boards, right? So same deal, right? It's hard to recruit them and find them, right? Kind of think back to, where they're involved. I think in the long run, that could have a huge effect on showing women that they should run for office, or showing those who find people to run for office, hey, here's this board. And I think actually that was sort of the idea to some degree. I'm not in the legislature, I can't say. But, the other thing is legally, Iowa has laws that require them to be more equal rightsy than some other states. And, well, you guys know this from the gay marriage thing. So I have a feeling that had something to do with it too. Again, that's a really long-winded answer, but I do think in the long run it could really matter. We're the only state that has anything like that. So part of the reason Vermont has 40% women is they don't pay their legislators anything. So the offices aren't desirable. right? So like California, you think, oh, they'd have a lot of women, right? They're really not any different than Iowa, but it's because the offices, their state Senate districts have more people in them than a US House district, right? They're really competitive and really big, kind of professional positions, so.
We've seen a lot of tragedies, gun-related, and Moms Demand Action is a group that's active here locally and all over the country. Are they, you know, you stopped at 2016. Are you seeing, just empirically or kind of noticing more action now because moms are demanding action? Are they recruiting candidates to run on another issue other than abortion, on guns?
Right. That's a good question. I haven't seen anything like that. We did see a few of these groups that had guns kind of listed as issue number 5, right? Or something like that on both sides, right? So as you expect, it would be divided. You know, a lot of these, you know, it's another weird thing about the US is we have all these interest groups and they don't really run candidates, but they can be sort of involved in the recruitment process. And so I would imagine it happened that way, but I haven't seen anything. Yeah. Oh, sorry.
Do you think the abortion litmus test turns women away from running, especially if, I'm sure most women like have stances, but I think it's expected that women have a strong stance on abortion and women's rights, and if they don't, do you think that turns women away from running because it's such a hot button topic?
I'm not really sure, actually. You know, from public opinion, and Jenna knows this because she took my Women in Politics class last semester, from public opinion, men are actually more pro-choice than women are, to a slight degree. But women tend to have stronger abortion opinions than men do, so it might match up, you know, well. But I have some anecdotal evidence that this does actually matter. This is purely anecdotal. We presented this at a conference in Pennsylvania in November, and it was half groups. And so, like, there were the leaders of, you know, Emily's List, and the woman who leads the Republican Federation of Women in New Jersey was there. And after we got finished with our presentation, she said, that abortion thing is dead on, and said, we have trouble, you know, finding places to send people if we want to train them because of that particular litmus test. Now, that's one person saying one thing, so it's very anecdotal. But I do think, kind of big picture, it might push people away who otherwise, right, would want to get involved. Especially because if you think that's 3/4 of the groups, right, kind of thinking back to that question, that means there's not a lot of groups that don't have that requirement of being pro-choice or pro-life, and none of the college groups have an abortion litmus test. So, like, you have to take all those out of the picture for women who aren't in college. So it's really a small number of groups that are like 50-50 and 20-20 that are like, you're a woman and want to run, let us help you, you know. So that, yeah, that would be my answer.
This is a really naive question, but I don't understand why abortion is such an issue in today's world. Why
yeah.
has it moved higher up?
My short answer would be interest groups have escalated the question, and the Supreme Court sort of allowed states to make different laws about it, and so, like, strategically, interest groups have an interest at the state level in really focusing on that issue because it is such a big issue in state legislatures. This is actually another paper I have is on, like, who introduces all these abortion bills, and it used to be Republican men, now it's Republican women as of about 2008. So it actually has made an impact policy-wise. I think the question for me is not why is abortion such an issue, but why are there no other issues but abortion, right? And in this world, right? Because there are issues other places, right? I don't think in the election this is the only thing people vote on. I really don't have an answer to that other than if you picture that graph I had of when the group started and that huge spike in the second wave of feminism, you know, I think a lot of those groups were right at the point of Roe versus Wade, right? And so they maybe fundamentally came about with this issue. Same with Emily's List. Emily's List was funded explicitly as a group that funds pro-choice women. Now, they're pro-choice women of either party, and they did have some Republican women, but that's kind of drying up, right? And so I think a lot of the lists probably, right, Susan B. Anthony list said, hey, now we're the, pro-life side, right? And we're only going to donate to pro-life candidates. And actually, they do donate to some Democratic women. But, just, do you see what I mean? Like, I think sometimes it's because this group did it, so now this group's doing it, and some of it's the origin of the groups.
I just don't understand why other voices haven't taken over and said, oh, guns are important, education is important, to drown out the both sides of it.
Yeah, I don't disagree. I'm surprised, like I said, I'm surprised there are not more groups with the 50-50 and 20-20 model of, we just want women in office. And I do suspect in the long run that could have negative implications for policies other than abortion if that's how you're choosing your candidates,
Can you speak to the issue versus that as a proxy for how they view other issues?
So Pete asked me, can I talk about how that issue alone or the issue as a proxy for how they view other issues? I do think it's a pretty good proxy for Democrat and Republican these days. But I think Jenna's question maybe is the answer to that, which is if they're choosing on that particular issue, does it turn off people who are interested in other issues, right, or whose background is in other issues? Or do they choose a different avenue, right? Maybe they're a woman candidate who's really interested in running. They look at that and they think, okay, well, I'm going to go elsewhere to get my help, or I'm not going to get help because of that. So that, to me, is maybe the biggest issue. I think at this point, abortion is a pretty good proxy for Democrat and Republican. I'm shocked that many groups choose on making sure the candidate is one or the other.
All right, with that, please join me in thanking Professor Osborn for an excellent
Thanks
presentation.
for coming.
I think Tracy did a great job of doing what we try to do at the Public Policy Center, take on some very difficult issues, if you will, and some that are often viewed as partisan, and laying them out in a very academic way and in a way that's just very worthwhile having a discussion and bringing people together to talk about what is the role of women in politics. So thank you again for doing that. Thank you all for your interest, and have a good evening.